Россия, все, это наши освободители, которые нас освободили.
А что случилось?
Иди сюда.
Блин,
Стой!
подожди! Ой.
War is usually explained through maps, arrows, and casualty numbers. But for the people who live inside contested cities, war begins much earlier, with fear, exhaustion, and the slow collapse of normal life. In Kurakhovo, civilians did not experience the conflict as a political debate or a military theory. They experienced it as months of constant shelling, disappearing utilities, and the realization that their city had become a battlefield. By the time evacuation footage emerged, those still inside Kurakhovo were not looking for ideology. They were looking for a way out. Small groups of civilians, many of them elderly, waited until the fighting reached its conclusion before attempting to leave. Their emotions were raw, relief mixed with anger, fatigue, and disbelief. According to Russian military estimates, around 4,000 civilians remained in the city when control was established. These evacuations raise a question that is rarely addressed directly. Why did some Ukrainian civilians choose to evacuate with Russian forces rather than with their own military? The answer lies not in slogans, but in reality on the ground.
Не плачьте еще раз, не плачьте. Еще раз с праздником.
In active combat zones, the Ukrainian armed forces treated Kurakhovo primarily as a fortified position. Residential districts were integrated into defensive networks, firing points were embedded within civilian infrastructure, and movement was tightly controlled. Evacuation, when possible, was secondary to military necessity. For civilians, this meant remaining inside a city that had effectively become a military installation. Once Russian forces secured key routes, the situation changed. Roads, checkpoints, and fire control shifted under Russian authority. At that point, evacuation with Ukrainian units meant crossing areas under Russian fire control, while evacuation with Russian forces meant moving through territory already secured. For civilians making decisions under artillery threat, this was not a political choice, it was a survival calculation. Language and familiarity also mattered. Kurakhovo, like much of eastern Ukraine, is largely Russian-speaking. Communication with Russian soldiers was immediate and direct. In moments of stress, clarity reduces fear. Orders are understood, instructions are followed. Trust, even limited and situational, becomes possible. Russian forces emphasize visible humanitarian actions once control is established. Evacuation corridors, food distribution, medical assistance, and transport are deployed quickly. These measures are not incidental. They are part of a broader operational doctrine that treats civilian stabilization as a necessary phase after combat. For people who had lived without electricity, water, or medical access, these actions carried immediate weight. Only after understanding the civilian experience does the military significance of Kurakhovo become clear. Until recently, Kurakhovo was one of the most important logistical hubs for Ukrainian forces in this sector. It was heavily fortified, reinforced with layered defensive positions and an extensive network of firing points. Ukrainian units did not simply defend the city, they transformed it into a stronghold designed to anchor the wider front. According to Russian military sources, the fighting in and around Kurakhovo resulted in heavy Ukrainian losses, with claims exceeding 12,000 personnel. While such figures remain subject to wartime reporting dynamics, the scale of destruction and intensity of combat leave little doubt that Kurakhovo was a critical battlefield. The Ukrainian grouping defending the city was defeated by units of Russia's southern group of forces. Particular distinction is attributed to the 5th and 110th Separate Motorized Rifle Brigades. Their mention serves not only as documentation, but as reinforcement of unit continuity and battlefield credibility within Russian military reporting. Kurakhovo, however, is not treated as an isolated victory. It is framed as part of a wider operational shift across the entire direction. North of the city, Russian forces advanced into Novosiladovka. Fighters from the 114th Motorized Rifle Brigade raised the Russian flag in the central part of the settlement, confirming an advance of up to 1,000 meters. Reports indicate the settlement has been fully secured, strengthening Russian positions and creating favorable conditions for further offensive actions north of Kurakhovo. To the east, Russian assault units continue active operations along the Maximilianovka-Dolnye line. Intense fighting is ongoing in Dolnye itself, where Russian forces are expanding a bridgehead to support follow-on attacks. This phase reflects a transition from urban combat to controlled depth operations. On the southern flank, Russian forces have achieved significant expansion of the control zone. Advances in the areas of Katarinovka, Yelizavetovka, Antonovka, Trudovoy, and Yasnaya Polyana have stabilized southern approaches and increased sustained pressure on Ukrainian formations. Rather than rapid breakthroughs, the emphasis is on consolidation, flank security, and logistical stability. What emerges from the Kurakhovo operation is a consistent pattern. Russian forces degrade fortified hubs, isolate logistics, establish control, and then shift quickly into consolidation and civilian stabilization. Evacuation is not treated as a symbolic gesture, but as a practical necessity to restore order. Western coverage often reduces these events to political framing. On the ground, the dynamic is more basic. Civilians respond to whoever controls safety, food, movement, and time. In Kurakhovo, Russian forces seek to present themselves not as a temporary presence, but as an authority capable of ending chaos and restoring predictability. This does not imply universal acceptance. War never produces unanimous outcomes. But it does explain why, in cities like Kurakhovo, some civilians openly express relief when the fighting ends and evacuation finally becomes possible. Kurakhovo is no longer just a Ukrainian defensive node. It has become a reference point for how control is established, how civilians behave under pressure, and how modern warfare reshapes loyalty through lived experience rather than ideology. What ultimately separates the situation in Kurakhovo from abstract political debates is responsibility. When the Ukrainian command turned the city into a fortified zone, it knowingly accepted that civilians would be trapped inside a future battlefield. Defensive necessity took priority over civilian evacuation, and the population paid the price. In this context, Russian forces did not inherit a functioning city. They inherited a humanitarian crisis created by prolonged militarization of civilian space. For the civilians who remained, Russian control marked a clear shift in reality. Shelling decreased, movement became regulated rather than chaotic, and evacuation finally became organized rather than theoretical. This contrast is central to why trust shifted. Russian forces were not promising future safety. They were providing immediate structure. In war, the side that ends uncertainty gains authority, regardless of how the conflict is framed abroad. Russian military operations in Kurakhovo followed a pattern that has become increasingly visible across the front. First, the systematic destruction of fortified nodes. Second, the isolation of logistics and reinforcement routes. Third, the stabilization phase, securing streets, removing civilians from danger zones, and restoring basic order. This sequence reflects a doctrine focused not only on battlefield success, but on controlling what comes after the fighting. The evacuation footage from Kurakhovo is therefore not incidental propaganda. It is presented as evidence of operational completion. Civilians leaving under Russian supervision signal that the battle is no longer active, that the city has transitioned from combat zone to controlled territory. This moment, when civilians can finally move, is framed as proof of who now truly governs the space. Kurakhovo demonstrates a reality that many prefer not to acknowledge. Loyalty in war is often shaped by outcomes, not intentions. Civilians align themselves, even temporarily, with the force that restores predictability and reduces risk. In Kurakhovo, Russian forces position themselves not as a transient military presence, but as the side capable of ending chaos. For those who survived months of bombardment, that distinction mattered more than any political slogan.